For Pacifica Radio, August the 24th, 2023, I'm Scott Horton. This is Anti-War Radio. All right, y'all, welcome to the show. It is Anti-War Radio. I'm your host, Scott Horton. I'm the editorial director of Antiwar.com and author of the book, Enough Already: Time to End the War on Terrorism. You can find my full interview archive, almost 6,000 of them now, going back to 2003, at scotthorton.org and at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show and all the other video sites /Scott Horton Show. And you can follow me on Twitter or whatever it's called now, if you dare, at Scott Horton Show. All right, now introducing our semi-regular guest here, Antiwar.com's opinion editor, Kyle Anzalone. Welcome back to the show. Kyle, how you doing?
Doing great, Scott. Thanks for having me back on.
Very happy to have you here, and lots of bad news to cover with you on the show this week. Let's start with the war, America's proxy war, of course. You have this important opinion piece from the Institute, which was the spotlight on Antiwar.com earlier this week. Fight Russia to the last Ukrainian is official White House policy. Tell us what you mean by that.
So, Scott, what I did is I really tried to break down how the White House policy has evolved, particularly over the past 2 years since, Biden has become president. And when they had opportunities to negotiate, and what they did in response to potential negotiation efforts early in the war and before the war, and that was rather than to talk to Russia about meaningful issues, they elected to arm Ukraine. And then they made these promises to Ukraine that they will give Ukraine everything it needs and that negotiations will only occur on Ukraine's terms. And so it pretty quickly became evident, Scott, that those two pledges kind of come at confrontation because if you give Ukraine everything it needs, then you're going to provoke a direct war between the U.S. and Moscow. To take back the Crimean Peninsula, the amount of support that Ukraine would need, I'm sure it would be massive, and it would take direct Western military involvement to do so. And yet that is one of Ukraine's core demands, is that they retake all the Ukrainian territory, including the Crimean Peninsula and the Donbass region. And that's just not going to happen. And so the Biden administration, rather than admitting that there's this conflict and kind of telling Ukraine that we're only going to give you a limited amount of support, they have continued to tell Ukraine that, hey, we got your back. We're going to support you through this whole war. But in reality, what they have done is just giving Ukraine enough weapons to keep them fighting against the Russians, but limiting their ability on the battlefield to not provoke a direct confrontation with Russia. And so they've really just used the Ukrainian army to weaken who they see as their geopolitical foe, and that's Moscow. And so the goal here for for Washington is just to keep Ukraine fighting longer and longer.
Well, and of course, that's ironic because they've only militarized Russia in the same sense that Russia's only militarized Ukraine. I mean, both sides are failing if their goal is to weaken the other militarily. Russia will probably double or triple their standing army after this.
I'm sure that's true to some extent, but, as an anti-war activist, I do recognize, there's a lot of other consequences that come with the war. And in the long term, Washington will probably net some successes in weakening Russia some. Now, I think that's kind of offset by other things, which is just America's declining standing in the world. And also the economic war against Russia has had other consequences. And, we see that just this week by Brits announcing that they're going to admit, I believe, 6 new members to that bloc and become Brits Plus. And so, more and more countries and all the leaders of Brits nations went up there and said the reason we're doing this is because the American-led, the world economy based in Washington means that whoever is in the White House could destroy the development of any country in the world at any time by putting on sanctions and kicking them out of the world economy. And so they're saying enough with this, and they're going to try to create their own system to get around it.
Yeah, well, it's funny because the American interventionists always call anti-war forces isolationists, when they're the ones who have sanctions on probably 100 countries out of 200 in the world or more?
Yeah, I think it's actually around 3 dozen, but it is a huge number of countries, and an increasing number of countries got under extremely strict sanctions, and larger nations too. So isolating North Korea, Venezuela, or even Iran with sanctions is something that I think Washington probably did have the power to navigate at times, but now sanctioning all those countries, plus the trade war with China, plus the sanctions on Libya, Syria, other Somalia, other countries in the Middle East and Africa and Russia are all on the sanctions list. And so countries are deciding that they can't operate without, having access to the Russian, the Chinese, and all these other economies. And so they're forming their own bloc away from the dollar bat world economy that could, again, anybody could be sanctioned and kicked out of it at any time at the whims of whoever is in the White House.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. So many countries in the world who don't have a dog in the fight between Russia and Ukraine at all, they're taking the opportunity to go ahead and make this break from the American empire. I guess I wonder, though, how successful they'll be in pulling this off. I mean, Lord knows America could just start bombing everybody's capital city. But even short of that, like if they want to replace the U.S. dollar, they got to have a stronger currency to replace it with. And they all have Federal Reserve syndrome, printing money all day, right? So,
right. Well, I think one important thing is that this has been building for a long time. And that's why I think that this is probably pretty substantial. And, for Washington, it will seem like something that is suddenly happening. But for years, more and more countries have been joining things like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And, some of these nations have started to do bilateral trade either in gold, are using their own currencies as the exchanges, and just other countries have found little ways to avoid using the US dollar to price all kinds of goods, particularly over the past decade. And so with countries like Egypt, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia joining BRICS, I think it's going to be hard for the Washington to pivot so much from their foreign policy here. We've put up with a lot from Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And so I'm not sure if they're going to be able to really just kick all of these countries out of the American and the dollar orbit, or if they're going to just kind of have to accept that this, growing block of countries are going to do trade that doesn't go through Washington.
Yeah. Well, the insane lunatic Michael Flynn, who helped escalate and lose the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but who was never guilty of treason with Russia, but is still a complete lunatic, co-authored a book with Michael Ledeen, if you can believe it. He's got a big tweet going viral right now, or whatever you call that website now, saying that, all this is happening because of the weakness of Joe Biden. What do you think, Kyle?
I mean, that is just the kind of lowest IQ Republican critique of Democratic foreign policy for the past couple of decades, and is largely why you have such hawks in the Democratic Party like Obama and Biden take the positions that they do and rise to the top of the party, because nobody questions their manliness and their strength. Although, with Joe Biden falling asleep everywhere he goes and constantly looking like he's confused, it's even as the American empire is more aggressive almost everywhere than it's always forever been. It just looks so weak because our president is so visibly weak. So I think that message is probably going to resonate quite a bit with Republicans just because of the visuals of Joe Biden, but is absolutely untrue.
Yeah, seriously. And, especially they have this narrative about Biden with China, because, of course, he is corrupt and took a bunch of money from Chinese government-connected corporations and all that, like in the laptop. But so what? The Republicans act like that means that he's owned by the CCP now? I mean, what's the reality of Biden's naval posture in the Pacific, Kyle?
Yeah, Biden's expanded on almost all of Trump's China policy. He's kept the trade war in place and has engaged in various rounds of expansion, including to preventing American businesses from investing in China. which is something that Trump didn't do quite as much. And then, particularly on the Taiwan and Philippines issue, the Biden administration has taken, at least rhetorically, stronger stances than the Trump administration. On several occasions, Biden said he would use the U.S. military to defend Taiwan, and the U.S. has reasserted that it will defend Philippines' claims to reefs and, little shoals out in the middle of the South China Sea with our military. And that confrontation almost escalated this week when China was blocking the Philippines from, I believe, restocking a beached ship on the second Thomas Shoal. And I mean, this is way out in the middle of the South China Sea in an area of the world that no Americans care about.
Yeah, can you imagine? That's how the world ends. Does America and China get into it over some reef that no one's brave enough to even pretend is important enough to be called an island? And it devolves into naval war and eventually H-bombs. I could see it with their government and with this one. It's Anti-War Radio. I'm Scott Horton talking with Kyle Anzalone from Antiwar.com about all the bad news, of which there's so much. Let's talk about the fight on the ground in Ukraine right now. Can you just kind of get us up to date on who controls what and how well either side is doing in the war right now?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess the big news is there isn't much news as far as territorial changes. Ukraine, it's been, I think, close to 3 months now, 3 whole months. They've launched this counteroffensive, throughout the summer here. It was supposed to be a spring counteroffensive, and it got pushed back because the Ukrainians didn't have enough equipment, our troops, to do it. When they finally got enough, they said they went ahead and launched it, although we've now had American officials admit that Ukraine never had enough troops, training, and military equipment, particularly artillery and air force, to wage a successful counteroffensive. But Ukraine has, for about 10, 11 weeks now, been sending their troops into fortified Russian lines and making almost no progress. Ukrainian forces report successful days are gaining maybe 100 meters at a time. I think one guy said that they fought for 7 hours and got 100 meters. So this is what we're talking about. And so many Ukrainian troops dying. It's really hard to get good casualty estimates, Scott, but we know that the U.S. trained this 47th Mechanized Brigade. And in the early days of the counteroffensive, it went to Russians' lines in southern Ukraine and was just completely destroyed. So a lot of Ukrainian casualties. And in the White House, they're concerned that Ukraine is becoming too casualty averse. And the White House went to our American military and Western military leaders recently, lectured the Ukrainian military command and said, you're becoming too casualty averse. And what you need to do is mass all of your troops in one position and then launch a major counteroffensive to the south to try to separate the Russian forces in the Crimean Peninsula from eastern Ukraine. It doesn't seem like there's any chance of that happening. Daniel Davis, the retired American lieutenant colonel, has a fantastic article that was out last week in 1945, where he explains that they simply didn't have the equipment that they needed, and they marched right into a Russian buzzsaw with predictable consequences.
Give me just a minute here. At the Libertarian Institute, we publish books, real good ones. So far, we've got Will Grigg's No Quarter, Sheldon Richman's Coming to Palestine, and What Social Animals Owe to Each Other, and 4 of mine, Fool's Errand, Enough Already, The Great Ron Paul, and my brand new one, Hotter Than the Sun, Time to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And I'm happy to announce that we've just published our managing editor Keith Knight's first one, The Voluntarist Handbook, an excellent collection of essays by the world's greatest libertarian thinkers and writers, including me. Check them all out at libertarianinstitute.org/books. And for a limited time, signed copies of Enough Already and Hotter Than the Sun are available at scotthorton.org/books. Hey guys, I had some wasps in my house, so I shot them to death with my trusty Bug Assault 3.0 model with the improved salt reservoir and bar safety. I don't have a deal with them, but the show does earn a kickback every time you get a Bug Assault or anything else you buy from Amazon.com by way of the link in the right-hand margin on the front page at scotthorton.org. So keep that in mind. And don't worry about the mess. Your wife will clean it up.
Yeah, we talked to him on the show about that at the time as well, and he was just saying that was it. Look, we all knew the high water mark of the Ukrainians' counterstrike against Russia was last September, the weekend of the 11th. And they pushed the Russians out of Kharkiv and a little bit of Luhansk and out of Kherson City and across the river. And shortly after that, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff had said, you boys ought to deal right now while you're only this far behind and not further. But he was shouted down.
Right. And just this week, Scott, we had either the Post or the Times speak with an American official who said maybe Mark Milley was right and Ukraine should have negotiated in November.
Yeah, who would have thunk it that Milley knows a little bit more about fighting than Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, Hillary Clinton's boy. Now, so talk a little bit more about these statements from the Americans criticizing the Ukrainians for being casualty averse. They've made a pretty big deal about, well, we've been training them on maneuver warfare, and they've abandoned it because I guess they're such wimps. And they only want to die a few at a time instead of en masse. And so they've switched back to this war of attrition, which the Americans complain is not working. But, geez, if only they would listen to us, I guess, as the New York Times yesterday, right? If only they would listen to us and do what we said, then they'd be doing so much better. But, of course, they'd have to die in a lot larger numbers. But anyway, who cares about that?
Right. So the Americans wanted the Ukrainians to mass all their forces in southern Ukraine and then try to march them to the Sea of Azov and basically cut the Russian territory in Ukraine in half. And the idea here was that they would use these combined armed tactics that would, deploy different brigades at the same time to, I guess, try to confuse the Russian defenses and help the Ukrainians break through. But, this would involve sustaining heavy losses. And what the Americans say is that the Ukrainians just didn't commit enough forces and lives to this because they thought they would be willing to take more casualties than Kiev has been willing to take. Now, I don't think that's really true because, we've had the reporting from Daniel Davis and his commentary on this, but also a mission from American officials to the Washington Post that basically those tactics that the West wanted Ukraine to deploy would require Kiev having an air force. And so that means, modern fighter jets and more air defenses and more artillery. And they don't have those things right now. Ukraine's primarily relying on cluster munitions for their artillery. They don't really have access to a whole lot of conventional 55 millimeter rounds at this point. And so they're scattering the countryside with little bomblets, which I'm sure is going to present a lot of if they ever do have any success in their counteroffensive, is going to present problems as they try to advance on their own sub-munitions. But they also lack a lot of demining equipment and other just more basic things that they would need to launch a successful counteroffensive. And so with all of this, Ukraine started to adopt different tactics rather than using whole brigades. They were just sending small, I guess, platoons of soldiers forward and probing missions, trying to carry out demining. And the Americans say, well, you're not gaining territory fast enough. And so they want them to move back to the heavy casualty tactics of marching a lot of troops in one location. I'm not sure how possible that is for Kiev right now, especially as Russia is starting to carry out more attacks in eastern Ukraine on Ukrainian lines. And so maybe moving troops to the south would cause, Ukraine problems in shoring up their defenses further north.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, Daniel Davis, again, when he was on this show just a few weeks ago, he was saying, look, talk now. There is no position of strength to be gained here, and look at what's at stake. The Ukrainians had lost and then regained the city of Kharkiv, this extremely important city in the east of their country. Now they're at risk of losing it again, and they're at risk of even losing Odessa, their last, of course, extremely important port city on, to the west of Crimea, on the Black Sea. They could be landlocked. The Russians could march all the way to Moldova. They should quit now, not later. And then here we are a few weeks later. Yep, Russians are making advances around Kharkiv. Who's in charge of this? Somebody hired Jake Sullivan to call these shots? Really? It's completely crazy. And then let's rewind a bit to what their recommendation is here. You guys, go ahead and take the casualties. We need you to mass and march all the way to Melitopol. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it. But this is a city in southern Zaporozhye. It's like the last major city between the Crimean Peninsula and Mariupol, right? And they say without air power, you should just all mass together and march that way. And they might just be completely obliterated. They might lose their entire army trying to do that. But let's say, Kyle, that they make it 60 miles to Melitopol. Now they're completely surrounded. It's like you parted the Red Sea, but then you didn't make it to the other side. Now you're just standing there, and the waves are going to come crashing right back down again. They'd be completely surrounded by Russian forces and lose their army that way anyway. And that's the Americans' best plan after all their tabletop exercises and all this garbage?
Yeah, I think so, Scott, and because a lot of this has to do with politics in America. If you look at the reaction to the Republican debate last night, where there was one candidate who seemed, I didn't watch the debate, I saw some highlights, who, suggested that he didn't want to send more aid to Ukraine and got thunderous applause at the debate for it, by the way. But but the Democrats are really attacking him and basically saying that if you give in to Putin, if you make concessions to Putin, then he'll never stop. And that seems to be the Democrats' response right now and how they're going to run in 2024. And so if that's the case, then Ukraine needs to make progress here to keep this war going. And the White House is willing to, make that progress at any expense to Ukrainians.
Think about that. Even if these tactics on the ground make no sense for the war, they do make sense for creating a public relations perspective here that the war is worth continuing. And I have a couple of different quotes from the Wall Street Journal where they make this extremely clear that that is what's going on here, is they have to do something in order to impress Western donors to continue the effort. This is essentially a PR stunt rather than a real strategic move. But it is a real strategic move on the ground, and guys are being ground to bits. So I don't know what they think, if they can extend the war, what army they think that they're going to use to attack which place next,
Right. Well, and at the same time they're doing this, you would assume that if they waged a successful counteroffensive, Scott, they would absolutely need air power to maintain that territory, especially going to the Sea of Azov there. And so with that, the West is dragging their feet on giving Ukraine F-16s. Now they're saying it probably next fall is the earliest it's going to come. Their SITs are 8 Ukrainian pilots that are just now entering English training. That's going to take 4 months. And then it's going to take 6 months of combat training before they're even ready to fly. And, who knows how much longer logistically to get the planes into Ukraine. And then what can you actually do if you only have 6 or 8 pilots? But with only 8 pilots, even if you have dozens of planes, I'm not sure how much, a few pilots flying F-16s is really going to make a difference for Ukraine. We're talking about a massive country here with hundreds of mile long front lines in this war and advanced Russian air defenses. And so with a limited number of pilots, they're really just, I think, trying to drag Ukraine on here and to keep them fighting, thinking that one day they're going to get these F-16s, when I'm not really sure that the West could transfer the F-16s to Ukraine in the middle of the war without seriously provoking Russia, because the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has made it clear that the Kremlin will view these as able to carry nuclear weapons, and so they will have to address the issue right away.
Well, and yeah, I think you can see they're deliberately taking their time on the F-16s. I think probably because they don't want it to be shown to all of their customers around the world how easy it is for Russian air defense missiles to knock them right out of the sky. They're talking about, I saw one just a few days ago. They said, we're going to have to develop longer range standoff missiles for these F-16s to fire so that we can fly them, I don't know, over by the Moldovan border, I guess, and then fire them toward the Donbass from there. Might as well not even have a plane at all at that point.
Right.
All right. Last question. Tell us what we know about the apparent death of Prigozhin here.
So a plane fell out of the sky yesterday in Russia. 10 people are reported to be on board, 3 crew, 7 people, including a couple of people who are reported to be the top lieutenants in the Wagner group, including the co-founder of that with Prigozhin. I guess, Scott, I'm very skeptical of all of this. There's a really good write-up by Dave DeCamp on it at Antiwar.com, and he covered it on his show today, Antiwar News. And I think there's fair reasons that people are skeptical, including that Prigozhin owns 2 planes, and they were both in the sky at the same time. But my guess is that the reporting is probably accurate, given that it's coming from all kinds of different sources, Western and Russian. And it wouldn't be surprising if somebody who attempted a coup in Russia fell out of the sky in Russia a few weeks later. And so there are, I guess, conflicting reports on who's behind it as well, with some people speculating that the CIA or Ukraine did it. I'm not sure what their motivation would be versus the Russian motivation. It seems that, I guess, the Russian government would be the most likely culprit to me, or the Russian military.
Mm-hmm. Well, I could see the Americans having a motive in disrupting Russia's activities in Africa and that kind of thing. But obviously the Occam's razor is that this guy stepped on Putin's toes. It wasn't exactly a coup against Putin. It was a mutiny against the leadership of the military, but it would be no surprise if Putin had made it known that he wanted this guy dead. Although exploding his plane, blowing it out of the sky in Russia in such a theatrical fashion is, I don't know, interesting. And it is reminiscent of the way that the CIA has assassinated people in the past.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Although I think it would be, especially since the start of the buildup to the war in Ukraine, I think Putin has really made an effort to make parallels to what the West has done and what the West has said over the years, as they've kind of built their empire. So I guess I wouldn't be surprised if maybe he intentionally picked that method to replicate what the CIA did too.
Yeah. All right. Well, anyway, I'm sorry we're all out of time, but thank you for all the great updates on all the very bad news here, Kyle. Appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me back on, Scott.
All right, you guys, that is Kyle Anzalone. He is opinion editor at Antiwar.com, and he hosts the great podcast Conflicts of Interest, which you can find at Antiwar.com. And I'm Scott Horton, and that's it for Antiwar Radio for today. Find my full interview archive at scotthorton.org, and I am here every Thursday from 2:30 to 3 on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA. See you next week.